Good evening. I'm Dr. Daniel Kempton, Vice President for Academic Affairs at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this evening's talk by Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia. But first, let me welcome our own Father President, Father Dave Pavanka, TOR, who will offer a word of welcome and an opening prayer.
And I, too, want to welcome you and thank you for spending the evening with us. Just a couple words and thoughts as we begin our evening and our celebration this evening. We were approached by Secretary Scalia and asked if we would be interested in hosting him this evening to give a talk, particularly on Christopher Columbus and on our Columbus Day. To which I was said, would we allow that? We're honored and excited to be. So just Secretary Scalia, it is a blessing to have you. Obviously, your family has been a great blessing to us and our country. I know your brother, who's a priest, and to have you with us is a tremendous blessing. So thank you for sharing your evening with us as well. One of the things I did today is I read a couple of articles over the last couple of days. Obviously, we find ourselves in a time when Columbus Day is unfortunately controversial. And there are statues over the last many days and weeks and months that have been torn down. And it bothers me, and it's something that I think it's important for us to be able to talk about and to be able to explore and discuss. We live in a history right now, in a world and a culture that is desiring in many ways to erase our history. And I think that that's dangerous. I think it's a dangerous precedent that we're trying to set that says this particular group or that particular group gets to define our history, gets to define what's important, gets to define what's not important, defines what's good and what's bad. And I think that's a problem that we're facing. And it's important for us, and that's why it's such a blessing to have the Secretary with us. It's important for us to be able to discuss this and to be able to talk about it and reconcile what is, in fact, our history. My suspicion is that in everybody's life, in yours and in mine, there are parts of our own personal history that we're profoundly proud of, things and accomplishments that we've done that we're very excited about, and also things that we regret, things that we as individuals have done that we wished we hadn't done, wished we would have done it differently, or perhaps approached a particular situation differently. That's our own history. But it's also the history of our country, is that there are things when we look back in our history that we should be profoundly proud of and things that we shouldn't be proud of. But by erasing it and canceling it ultimately doesn't serve us well. It doesn't serve us present well, and it doesn't serve our future well. If the loudest group begins to determine what our history looks like without what is true, where do we find ourselves in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years from now? And we are gathering this evening, obviously, as a community of faith here at Franciscan University. And one of the things that I was reflecting on, that particularly as Catholic Christians, we have something to say to this. There's a way that we look at history, even the history which is most difficult. I would suggest that the darkest day in our history of humanity was the day that Jesus was arrested, he was tried, he was scourged, he was crowned with thorns, and ultimately executed. We as humanity should be deeply ashamed of that. And yet we as Catholic Christians, not only do we not run away from that, we are invited every day to reflect on that, to think about that. In many ways, to place that in the center of our lives. So in every church we walk into, we see a cross that reminds us of our history. The cross reminds us, I suggest, of two things. One, the horrible things that humanity can do. The cross reminds us of that which is worst in each one of us. Number two, it reminds us of what God is capable of. God's goodness, his kindness, his mercy. That the cross reminds us that we ultimately will not be defined by our weakest moments, that we will not be defined by our greatest sin, by our largest mistakes, Rather, what defines us is God's mercy and his kindness and the ability to bring about transformation and conversion and healing and growth. What we're being invited to today by Secretary Scalia is to look at our past and to recognize and see things that are wonderful and beautiful and good, and also recognize things that we have done that have not always been the best. But that will not define us. In the same way that the Lord does not define us by our greatest difficulty, our greatest struggle, our greatest sin, nor should this. So we ask the Lord's blessing and his peace to be with us in this gathering, that we would know the truth, and the truth will ultimately set us free. Amen?
Thank you, Father Dave. It is now my honor to introduce Secretary Scalia, who was sworn in as Secretary of Labor in 2019. As Secretary, he oversees the enforcement and administration of more than 180 federal employment laws covering more than 150 million workers and 10 million workplaces. He also chairs the Board of Directors of the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which insures U.S. private pension plans, and is on the Board of Trustees of the Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund. Secretary Scalia's priorities include enhancing employment opportunities for Americans by supporting economic growth through reductions in unnecessary regulatory burdens, improving the effectiveness and efficiency of the department's enforcement programs, and bolstering worker training through apprenticeships and other business-driven programs that emphasize performance and accountability. Under his leadership, the Labor Department has supported President Trump's initiatives to promote employment for veterans and military spouses, to overcome the opioid crisis, and to help Americans exiting the criminal justice system re-enter the workforce. In addition to serving on the White House Coronavirus Task Force, Secretary Scalia guides the Labor Department as it plays a central role in overseeing the new federal programs intended to help workers and their families respond to COVID-19. The department is also involved in implementing the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the NAFTA replacement negotiated by President Trump that includes the strongest labor protections ever included in an international trade agreement. When Secretary Scalia was administered the oath of office, President Trump called him, and I quote, "one of the most qualified people ever confirmed as Secretary of Labor," unquote. His experience includes serving as Solicitor of Labor, the department's top legal officer, and working as a special assistant to Attorney General William P. Barr, for which he received the Justice Department's highest Distinguished Service Award. He also spent many years as a partner at a prominent law firm where he was called visionary by one legal publication for his work challenging unlawful regulations. And he was recognized by other publications as a leading practitioner for labor and employment law, securities law, and appellate litigation. Secretary Scalia graduated with distinction from the University of Virginia and attended the University of Chicago Law School, where he graduated cum laude and served as editor-in-chief of the Law Review. He and his wife, Trish, have 7 children. He is the son of Maureen and Antonin Scalia, the late Supreme Court Justice. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Scalia to the podium.
Thank you, and Dr. Kempton, thank you for that introduction and for the important work that Franciscan University does to educate young people and fortify their faith. Father Dave, thank you for your remarks as well, and I appreciated the opportunity earlier today to tour the campus just a little bit with you. I've heard so many good things about this university over the years, and privileged to be able to be here and spend some time with you. Well, I'm here today to celebrate Columbus Day, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say a word about another extraordinary Italian for whom this university is named. Nearly 800 years later, St. Francis's holiness, courage, and the sheer range of what he did and stands for are still breathtaking. His influence is even more apparent today than it was then. His example is no less powerful. Well, this day, Columbus Day, has been part of our American heritage for more than a century. There are some now who would like to do away with this commemoration. My message is that would be a mistake. Columbus Day stands for ideals and principles that are woven into the fabric of our nation and which are as important today as they were on the first Columbus Day. They are ideals and principles that underlie some of the programs we administer at the Labor Department, and they are ideas and principles that Columbus Day's critics actually claim to share. So I want to spend a few minutes with you today exploring, pardon the pun, why Columbus Day remains an important and fundamentally American holiday. The book of Proverbs tells us, quote, "The human heart plans the way, but the Lord directs the steps." That verse must have occurred to Columbus when he reflected on his journey to the New World. For one, he nearly never made it. On his first voyage west, his crew mutinied more than once, frightened of the lands that lay, or maybe didn't lie, ahead. Columbus's geography was, of course, hopelessly wrong, landing him on the edge of, for him, a new continent instead of India, China, or Japan. Today, we can be grateful that the mutinies and Columbus's plans failed. He opened the way to a new world and to a nation that remains a beacon of freedom to all the world. But although Columbus survived a 15th century mutiny, he wasn't so lucky this past summer. On the 4th of July, a mob in Baltimore toppled a statue of Columbus, dragged into the harbor, and threw him into the bay. When this was done, one of the mob shouted, quote, "This is the only way we can stop hatred." Evidently, the guy thought about it. You know, throwing a statue in the ocean was the only way to stop hatred. Across the country, more than 30 statues of Columbus have been or are scheduled to be removed. Just a couple hours from here, in the capital city of this great state, 2 Columbus statues have been removed, but obviously that doesn't fully solve the problem since you still have that city's name. But a plan has been proposed for that too, changing Columbus, Ohio to Flavortown, Ohio, in honor of a celebrity chef, I'm told. After safely crossing the Atlantic 8 times, this is how deep Columbus has sunk. Well, I hasten to add that this year Columbus is not alone. In fact, he's in what you'd think is some pretty good company. Back home in the nation's capital, we call it the District of Columbia, a committee appointed by the mayor recently recommended that the city, quote, "remove, relocate, or contextualize not just a statue of Columbus, but the Washington Monument and Jefferson Memorial, a famous statue of Abraham Lincoln paid for by freed slaves, in which he holds the Emancipation Proclamation and stands behind a young black man who is crouching and beginning to rise from the shackles of slavery. Activists want that statue ripped out too. In San Francisco, statues of Francis Scott Key, Ulysses Grant, and Father, now Saint Junipero Serra, have been wrenched from the ground. A visitor from another era might ask, who would do such things? Revanchist loyalists to George III? The ghost of Jefferson Davis? No. Activists who want to fundamentally redefine how we view our nation's character and legacy. These revisionists want us to see America from the arrival of the earliest settlers as oppressive and discriminatory at its core. Hence the so-called 1619 Project published last year by the New York Times. The Times explained that 1619 was the year that chattel slavery was, quote, inaugurated in North America, and said the 1619 project would, quote, reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year. The project's creator said that anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, and that, quote, one of the principal reasons some of the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery, end quote. This portrayal of American history has been vigorously disputed by some of our most prominent historians. And in truth, our nation's origin is straightforward and encapsulated by Abraham Lincoln, quote, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That is what Thomas Jefferson declared for the Continental Congress when breaking from England to pursue our unalienable God-given rights. George Washington said, the establishment of civil and religious liberty was the motive which induced me to the field in the Revolutionary War. And Charles Carroll, a Catholic signer of the Declaration, called the principles in that document the, quote, best earthly inheritance he could leave for future generations. Well, of course, we know that the founders did not fully live according to the ideals they espoused. They were sinners. They were fallen. In that respect, they were like all of us here. They also lacked the vision to fully see the implications and promise of what they wrote. But they supplied the vision and principles for generations of Americans to forge the freest nation on earth. And they had the genius to craft a constitution that made fulfilling those ideas possible. When Lincoln appealed to the better angels of our nature, he appealed to those ideals in the founding documents. His great contemporary, Frederick Douglass, said the Constitution wasn't a pro-slavery instrument, but a glorious liberty document. Martin Luther King called us to account by invoking the words of the founders from the steps of the Capitol. Quote, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note, end quote, and King was there to collect payment. He's a hero of mine, both for his courageous fight against inhumanity and for the patriotic way he did so, calling on America to be even more American, to be even truer to the founders' vision. Well, I've been speaking about America when you came to hear about Columbus, but the two are closely linked, so much so that some early Americans wanted to name the nation Columbia. What did earlier generations of Americans see in Columbus, and what should we see now? Well, history has not been very forthcoming about Columbus. Key facts of his life remain uncertain, and the mythology that surrounded him obscured realities that recently have received attention. Sometimes, admittedly, this can make for the best heroes, more symbol than person, more ideal than a tally of individual virtues and vices. Columbus had grave faults. He participated in the slave trade, as did others in his day, and was a harsh and at times inhumane ruler of indigenous people he subjugated. Many of the men and women we admire from centuries ago had grave failings. Washington and Jefferson held slaves. Lincoln made statements about blacks that we would never countenance today. Reaching farther back in time, St. Thomas More sanctioned practices toward Protestants that we condemn. So did Queen Elizabeth toward Catholics. But these men are our forebears. They achieved and stand for great things, and it is for those things, not for their errors, that we admire and hold them as examples today. Leaders of the Confederacy present a separate question for this reason. The failings of great men and women should remind us of human frailty and of our own. Their failings counsel our own humility. They do not counsel condemning today people of another era who, in their imperfect, fallibly human way, built the extraordinary land of freedom and opportunity that we are fortunate to enjoy. So if we love this country, and we do, we are right to credit Columbus for opening the way to a new world. And that was, of course, a large part of what made him a fitting hero for a new nation. For 18th century American revolutionaries, Columbus was both a widely known forebearer, and he wasn't British, and there were very few people who could check both those boxes. He had displayed great courage. No one in his world knew what lay west, and it was an act of daring and vision to sail that direction toward Asia with limited provisions in a huge expanse of ocean behind him. What Columbus found at the edge of that expanse was, for Europeans, a new world with boundless possibilities. Those possibilities allowed a break from the old world, something that Washington, Jefferson, and their contemporaries were now striving to achieve. The new world was already being called Columbia, personified by a statuesque female figure who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Britannia. This gave us the District of Columbia, the Columbia River, and Columbia, South Carolina. King's College in New York, which was named for George II, became Columbia University. Through the centuries, Columbus came to represent the spirit of adventure and discovery that we associate with America. Our faith in our capacity to seek and find something new and better. We have many heroes who personify our political ideals, but no figure so associated with the questing, the entrepreneurialism, the hope in the new that is part of the American spirit. No other figure so represents our aspirations to make, here in this country, something new and better than the oppressive and rigidity associated with that old world. So President Franklin Roosevelt described Columbus's discovery as the promise of a new beginning in the march of human progress. Reagan called him a dreamer, a man of vision and courage, whose adventurous spirit lives among us. President Benjamin Harrison, in his first Columbus Day Proclamation, called him the pioneer of progress and enlightenment. And in his celebrated biography of Frederick Douglass, the historian David Blight recounts how a book called The Columbian Order, quote, changed Douglass's life. The Order was a collection of patriotic and anti-slavery writings that Douglass used to teach himself to read, to deliver speeches, and Blight says, to, quote, develop a vocabulary of liberation. The first national recognition of Columbus Day was 1892, the 400th anniversary of his arrival in the New World. Harrison presented it as a unifying, patriotic day. Here, not so long after the end of the Civil War, was a national hero who was neither North nor South, not a Virginian and not a New Englander, a hero who had predated and transcended all of that. In proclaiming Columbus Day, Harrison called for exercises at every schoolhouse, quote, to impress upon our youth the patriotic duties of American citizenship. One of those exercises would be a new Pledge of Allegiance, a statement of loyalty to the nation's flag and founding ideals. As you know, students pledged allegiance to the Republic, not to the authoritarian regimes of the old world. They pledged to one nation, indivisible, a reference to the war that had just ended. And they pledged liberty and justice for all. That brings us to another crucial and for some of us more personal significance to Columbus and Columbus Day. The mid to late 19th century had seen swelling numbers of Catholic immigrants to America from Italy, Ireland, and Germany. These men and women were subjected to systemic discrimination and derision. They were accused of divided loyalties, of being agents of the Pope. As Catholics set up their own schools, more than 35 states adopted what were called Blaine Amendments to bar government funds from ever aiding those schools. In a decision last term, Supreme Court Justice Alito called the federal legislation on which these state amendments were modeled an act of virulent prejudice against immigrants, particularly Catholics. The Ku Klux Klan was an active supporter. Immigrants from Italy were subjected to particularly severe attack. In New Orleans in 1891, a year before that first Columbus Day, a mob broke into a jail and killed 11 immigrants who had just been acquitted of murdering the city police chief. The New York Times noted with satisfaction the death of these, quote, sneaky and cowardly Sicilians, a pest without mitigations. Nearly 100 years after that first Columbus Day, when my father was appointed to the Supreme Court, he was surprised and moved by what it meant, how important it was to Italian Americans to have an Italian American sit on the nation's highest court as a riposte and a rebuke to those who, even to that day, mocked Italian Americans as gangsters and mobsters. Well, back in the 19th century, in the face of sharp hostility associated with religion and national origin, Columbus became a powerful symbol of the claim of Irish, Italian, and Catholic immigrants that they, too, were fully American. The nation's Protestant elite could proudly claim forebears among the sons and daughters of the Revolution. Columbus was an equally proud answer that Italians and Catholics, too, had roots in the nation's founding and a claim to be fully American. Many American Indians would make a similar point a century later when they asked to be recognized as Native Americans. 10 years earlier, in 1882, the Knights of Columbus had been founded, a Catholic fraternal organization dedicated to charitable work, particularly for homes that had lost a breadwinner. One historian has explained that for the Knights, quote, Columbus was a world hero against American nativism, a symbol providing social legitimacy and patriotic loyalty. I'm honored the Knights of Columbus are with us this evening. The Knights were leading proponents of that first National Columbus Day celebration. But the celebration held meaning for more than Catholics and Italians. More than 15,000 school children marched in a Columbus Day parade in New York City. A leading historian of Italian Americans, Dr. William Connell, tells us that participants included students from public schools, Catholic schools, the Hebrew Orphanage Asylum, and a Native American marching band. And Connell, this historian, suggests that the Italians murdered in New Orleans may not have been the only massacre on Benjamin Harrison's mind when he signed that first Columbus Day proclamation. Just a year before that, the U.S. Army had killed as many as 300 Lakota Sioux at Wounded Knee. The first Columbus Day, Connell tells us, was supposed to recognize the greatness of all of America's people, but especially Italians and Native Americans. The celebration, he writes, marked, quote, the first encounter that brought together the original Americans and future ones. Let me say another word about Native Americans who, of course, found the New World before Columbus, who suffered terribly as this nation grew, and who in their own way stand for a spirit of freedom that we hail as American. There's a movement to redesignate Columbus Day in honor of Native Americans. But to honor Native Americans, you need not dishonor Italian Americans and Catholics and denigrate a day that for millions of Catholics represents an early turning away from the nativism and know-nothingism that buffeted them in 19th century America. That first Columbus Day welcomed Catholics and recent immigrants as equal sharers in the American dream and acknowledged, if only for a day, Native Americans as rightful participants in our national heritage. Maligned by progressives today, Columbus Day was an early celebration of something progressives purport to value: diversity and inclusion. In fact, Columbus Day is a more meaningful reflection on American diversity and inclusion than some of what masquerades as diversity training in some workplaces today. Recently, we learned of so-called diversity training given to employees at the U.S. Department of Treasury who were taught that, quote, virtually all white people, regardless of how woke they are, contribute to racism. Workers at one federal lab were given materials telling them that racism, quote, is interwoven into every fabric of America, quote. At another federal lab, workers were told that an emphasis on rationality over emotionality is a characteristic of white males. And the Smithsonian Institution was shamed into removing from its website a graphic which taught that hard work and believing in one God are, quote, aspects and assumptions of whiteness. Well, as you know, these blunderbuss assertions are false. My father was the son of an Italian immigrant who, and my father once wrote, came to this country when he was a teenager and never profited from the sweat of any black man's brow, end quote. He continued, there are many white ethnic groups that came to this country in great numbers relatively late in its history, and not only took no part in the major historical oppression of blacks and others, but instead, as we've heard, were themselves the objects of discrimination. So no, harboring racist views is not the shared heritage of white Americans. For many, it's quite the opposite. As Columbus Day reminds us, Catholics, Irish, Italians, Poles, Jews, and others have had their own struggles gaining acceptance in American society. Columbus Day is a day about overcoming that. It's a day that was first set aside to embrace this country's diversity and welcome all citizens into the American polity, regardless of creed or national origin. Our nation did not establish Columbus Day to commemorate oppression or discrimination. We established Columbus Day to overcome it. Because training in workplaces like that which I described a moment ago is false and offensive and even injurious, President Trump signed an order last month that bars race and sex stereotyping and scapegoating in training programs at federal workplaces and by federal contractors. By this, we mean workplace training programs that attribute particular traits or status to someone because of his or her race or sex, as well as training programs that assign blame or bias to someone just because, again, of that person's race or sex. The order makes clear that ascribing racist or sexist intentions to a worker just because of his race or sex is not only hurtful, but a violation of law. Under the President's order, the Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs will implement the requirement that federal contractors not engage in race or sex stereotyping or scapegoating. We've already set up a hotline to receive complaints from concerned workers, and will soon be issuing a public request for information to learn more about the types of training provided to employees of federal contractors. I should also be clear about what the President's new order does not do. It does not prohibit workplace training about non-discrimination and equal opportunity. That training is important. The Labor Department encourages it, and in some instances, we require it. Nor does the order prohibit the diversity training offered by countless American employers, training that, like my remarks today, emphasizes the importance of recognizing the value and worth of people of all races and creeds. American employers should value diversity and take extra strides to assure opportunity for those who in the past have been denied it, although they must do so in a way that does not discriminate against others based on race, ethnicity, or other protected characteristics. Finally, the President's order does not prohibit training about preconceptions or biases that people may have, regardless of their race or sex, about people who are different, and which could cause slights or even discrimination that's unintentional. What the order does prohibit, though, is instruction in which federal contractors tell workers that because of their particular race or sex, they are racist, morally culpable, or less worthy of being heard. Well, My remarks to this point have focused on Columbus Day's origins as a day about what today is called diversity and inclusion. And let me say a few words about a particular kind of inclusiveness and a particular kind of discrimination that were on people's minds at that first Columbus Day and remain a subject worthy of reflection today. I'm referring to respect for people of different faiths, including Catholics' right to live their faith while participating fully and equally in American civic life. Not long ago, a nominee to the federal courts was subjected to pointed questions by 2 U.S. senators for being a member of the Knights of Columbus. One senator noted that the head of the Knights had described abortion as, quote, a legal regime that has resulted in more than 40 million deaths, end quote. The senator asked the judicial nominee if he was aware that the Knights of Columbus oppose a woman's right to choose. Was he aware of that when he joined the organization? The senator also asked, quote, were you aware that the Knights of Columbus opposed marriage equality when you joined, end quote. A second senator accused the Knights of taking, quote, a number of extreme positions and asked the nominee if he would resign his membership, quote, to avoid any appearance of bias. As this audience well knows, this nominee was being attacked for belonging to a Catholic organization that is active in thousands of parishes throughout the country and which espouses the teachings of the Catholic Church. His Catholicism was being used to question his fitness for office, a form of discrimination to which the Knights of Columbus and Columbus Day itself stand opposed. This suspicious treatment of active participation in the Catholic community is apparent, too, in statements about President Trump's inspiring nominee to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett. As we saw today, Judge Barrett is an accomplished scholar and judge and the mother of 7. She has been active in a charismatic Christian group in South Bend known as People of Praise. Her vibrant faith caused one senator to caution at the judge's hearing for a Court of Appeals position 3 years ago, quote, the dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern. Well, allow me to suggest this. Let's not cancel Columbus Day while some in high office are still internalizing its message of religious inclusiveness. The fastidious disdain toward religion, I'm quoting William Bennett, that I've been describing is also reflected in a rule adopted several years ago, which we at the Department of Labor recently proposed eliminating. One of the great gifts of people of faith to this country and to humanity is care of the poor and needy, a calling exemplified by Christ and, of course, by St. Francis. But in 2016, the federal government adopted a rule saying that when religious organizations receive federal funds in connection with providing charitable services, they have to warn the people they help about their religious character. If the aid recipient objects, the organization has to give him the name of a non-religious organization he can go to instead. Additionally, a religious group has to tell aid recipients how to file a complaint with the federal government against the group if its religious activities infiltrate the services it's providing. These federal requirements single out religious organizations for special burdens that are not placed on others. They cast suspicion on people of faith for providing services that they feel called to offer and which they have performed marvelously, miraculously, for millennia. As I said, we are in the process of a regulatory proposal to remove those rules so religious grantees are treated equally. But the rule's adoption reflects, I believe, the same new, bold challenge to religion that we have seen in recent treatment of judicial nominees. This defies a respect for religion deeply rooted in our Constitution and national tradition. Quote, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity. George Washington counseled in his farewell address, quote, "Religion and morality are indispensable supports." The framers believed that by fortifying our faith, we fortified our country. And they believed passionately in religious freedom and permitting people of all faiths to participate fully in American political life. So today, Columbus Day, we reflect on the thrill of discovery of a new world and the opportunity it presented to make the world anew, freed from the religious wars, hereditary monarchies, and class restrictions that had burdened the old world. The hope, the optimism, the capacity for change in a new world are part of our heritage as Americans. When Columbus set sail to that new world, he set us all on course to a better world. We should never forget that. Columbus Day is a reminder, too, of the challenges and ostracism faced by earlier generations of Americans on account of religion and ethnicity. Encountering that skeptical resistance and surmounting it is part of our shared patrimony as Americans. This day, Columbus Day, began as a day to bring us together, regardless of religion or ethnicity. The Americans to whom we extend this invitation is broader now than in the 19th century. Some of the latecomers to that invitation, and I'm thinking particularly of African Americans, are those who suffered most, by far. But we do not continue on the path the Founding Fathers charted by abandoning Columbus Day. Rather, we become better Americans by using this day to recall the newness, the novelty, and promise of this great nation, and how welcoming those different from us has not always come easily in America, but has been one of our greatest sources of strength. Thank you very much. And happy Columbus Day.
Thank you, Secretary Scalia, for that very excellent and thoughtful discourse on Columbus Day. We do have time for about 5 or 10